Welcome to another episode of Troy Story, the podcast that seeks to unpack and explain the most enduring of all ancient legends. And in this episode, we're going to dig into the most famous bit of the Trojan War story and ask, was the Trojan Horse a real thing? It's possibly the most iconic part of the legend of the Trojan War. A wooden horse, built hollow, big enough to hide a band of warriors inside, then left as a tribute to the Trojans or their gods by a Greek army who had been laying siege to the city for 10 years, but had finally given up hope of ever conquering Troy and sailed for home. But it's a ruse. The Greek fleet hasn't gone far and will soon be back. Meanwhile, the Trojans are overjoyed the Greeks seem to have gone. They have to think about what to do with the wooden horse. Some say burn it. Some say bring it into the city as a sacred offering to the goddess Athene. The optimists win through. The horse is brought inside the city. And as the horse won't fit through the city gates, the Trojans pull down a section of wall to get the job done. The Trojans start a round of victory feasting and celebrations, and the Greeks bide their time. At night, the Greeks slip out of the horse and start the killing, while their fleet returns alerted by a signal fire lit by a spy planted in the city. The groggy Trojans are unable to put up a fight. Troy is sacked and burned, its people are killed or enslaved. But can any of this be true? Or is it all just a myth? Now, here's a spoiler alert. If you think the legend of the Trojan War is total fantasy, just a tale made up by an ancient storyteller, you'll be in the minority, even among skeptical academics. There's actually now compelling evidence that Troy was a real place, and that at some point, after 1200 BCE at the end of the Bronze Age, someone burned it to the ground. We just don't know who. Few now have any doubt that the name most often used by Homer for the Greeks in the Iliad, the Achaeans, or Achaioi in Greek, harks back to an ancient Bronze Age kingdom known as Achaeawa, that was probably headquartered in Greece at a place called Mycenae, which the legend tells us were the home of King Agamemnon, who led the Greeks to Troy. And there's ample evidence that Achaeawa was getting involved in the part of the world where Troy is located, and sometimes this included armed conflict. These things are now quite well known and rarely challenged, so we know there's at least something to be said for there being a historical truth behind the legend. And there's plenty of additional clues and bits of evidence that are intriguing but not decisive. Plenty of puzzles still to solve. But first things first, we need to take a moment to think about a rather important problem. If we think there is truth behind the legend, how much truth does there need to be for the legend to be considered in some way a true story? Do we need to find evidence that a Greek king called Agamemnon went to war against Troy for 10 years using the kidnap or elopement of his brother's wife, Helen of Troy, as a pretext? And that Troy was only taken because of the ruse of the wooden horse? Or are we just looking for confirmation that some of the key basics are true? The Greeks went to war with Troy for reasons unknown and destroyed it, or at least won the war. This seems to be the level of proof most people are looking for, because if we can get that far, then we can enjoy the thrilling stories even more because we can believe that some of the actual characters and events the stories portray could have been real, including the tale of the Trojan Horse, even if we'll never really know. What can be more problematic is a tendency to take the little bit of historical evidence as a green light to then treat ancient literary works, the ones attributed to Homer, as sources that can now be mined for historical data. It's very tempting given how sparse historical sources are for the Late Bronze Age in Greece, for which read almost non-existent. If the contents of Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, can be admitted as historical evidence, they promise a rich seam of material to add flesh to the archaeological bones. People have been mining this seam ever since the 1870s when Heinrich Schliemann found Troy using Homer as a guide. People still do it, and with wildly varying degrees of caution. Some take on board that the tradition of the Trojan War stories as we have it has undergone a lot of evolution and change over the centuries between when the Trojan War might have happened, let's say 1200 BCE or thereabouts, and when the Iliad and the Odyssey were first written down, 700 BCE or thereabouts. Others have taken the view that Homer's version is mostly true to its roots in the Bronze Age, and pick out bits of the text to prove it. A typical example is that when Homer provides a rather enigmatic description of a hero's huge shield, this could be literary exaggeration, a big shield for a larger-than-life hero. But for some scholars and enthusiasts, it's a sure sign Homer is preserving memories of the large body shields that were in use several centuries before his own time, back in the Bronze Age, and that his Achaean warriors are clearly therefore Mycenaeans, what we call Bronze Age Greeks, even if these body shields were out of fashion by the time someone torched Troy. There's a perfectly good and very interesting question about whether Homer is describing Bronze Age equipment and Bronze Age realities rather than those of his own time or a more recent past. But it's not yet been satisfactorily answered. Homer's frequent and detailed word descriptions of the hero's arms and armour can be confusing to the modern reader, and they are poetry. And so it's relatively easy to interpret it by reference to fragmentary Bronze Age archaeological finds and provide speculative reconstructions that then fix the look of Homer's heroes in our minds. But to be clear, the only item referenced that can actually definitively be fixed in time as a Bronze Age piece of kit is a helmet made of boar's tusks, just the one, that turns up in Book 10. Even then, it's described as an heirloom. It's already a bygone, if not an antique. Those who embrace the Iliad as a historical source agree that we need to make some edits to cut out all the stuff we simply can't believe. In effect, we're entitled to believe the believable, but we're free to cut out the unbelievable, if of course we can agree on what is unbelievable. Now, snipping out all the parts where the gods get directly involved and supernatural stuff happens seems a pretty obvious step. We know the Greek gods aren't real because, well, nobody worships them anymore. And anyway, if they were real, they wouldn't behave like that, would they? We're still left with some bits that seem a little incredible, and maybe we need to argue them away, or rewrite them to fit our expectations of useful historical information. Which brings us back to the most iconic image of the Trojan War legend. Is the wooden horse something we should discard as simply unbelievable? The model of the Trojan horse that looks over the visitor's entrance at the archaeological site of Troy might inspire tourists to imagine the legend, but it doesn't inspire confidence as a reconstruction of what a real Trojan horse might have looked like. So what can we say about it? Now, what many don't realise is the Trojan horse does not appear in the Iliad, the surviving epic poem from ancient Greece over 15,000 lines long that is the most famous tale of the Trojan War. That's because it only covers about 50 days of action that take place towards the end of a 10-year war, but its story still ends months before the actual capture of Troy with the Trojan horse. The horse does appear in the Odyssey. This is the epic poem telling the story of the return from Troy of Odysseus, one of the most famous Greek heroes who had fought in the war. The brief mention is just a flashback, a few lines in a poem of over 12,000. A bard is asked to sing the song of the Trojan horse, and the story is summarized. Brevity suggests the audience is already familiar with the story. It didn't need explanation. That means the Trojan horse was already widely known part of the tradition and stories about the Trojan War at a point when the earliest surviving works of Greek literature were first written down. The full story of the Trojan horse was contained in other epics that haven't survived to modern times. We know of their contents thanks to summaries made by ancient scholars who still had access to them. We also know that tradition suggests the horse was imagined to be big enough to hide anything up to 50 warriors. Sources vary, but they're possibly influenced by what would you imagine to be the crew of a typical raiding ship, ranging from a 20-oared Ikosaros to a 50-oared Pentaconta. As the rowing crew and payload of warriors are one and the same, this sets the scale of your basic raiding party. But the Trojan horse is the subject of the earliest image we can definitively say depicts a scene from the Trojan War. This is on a pottery vase found in the 1960s on the island of Mykonos, associated with an ancient burial. It's huge, over 1.3 meters or over 4 feet tall. Made in the first half of the 7th century BCE, it's decorated with vivid scenes in relief across its surface. Chief among them, an enormous horse with Greek warriors inside who are hiding in rather plain sight. You would be justified in wondering why the Trojans don't know the horse's trouble because In this depiction, it has many windows, and the Greeks are clearly visible looking out of them. The prominent scenes below on the belly of this huge jar pull no punches. What they depict is a scene of slaughter, in which children appear to be the chief victims. This is usually interpreted to show us the killings committed by the Greeks as they sack Troy. If so, it's in cold blood. The warriors who were hiding in a horse were fully armed for battle. These murderers have removed all of their war gear, depicted only in their loincloths and with swords. This is incidentally what you'd expect a warrior to be wearing having just got out of bed, taking up a sword being something a hero does as part of getting dressed in the morning. Major signal, there's no more fighting to be done. The Greeks are sacking the city and killing its inhabitants at their leisure. I suspect it's also possible to interpret the images as Trojan fathers and husbands, roused from their sleep by the sudden Greek onslaught, and knowing all is lost, grimly putting their own children to the sword before the Greeks get a chance to kill or enslave them. Either way, it's a reminder that while the Trojan horse has offered the Greeks final victory after an exhausting and bloody war, what it means for the Trojans is suffering, ruin, and death. When people express skepticism about the story of the Trojan horse, this is quite often a disbelief that the Trojans could have been dumb enough to fall for it, rather than that the Greeks could have been clever enough to build it. That's not new. This kind of thinking goes all the way back to ancient times. But so far as we know, there are no ancient versions of the Troy story in which Troy is conquered by any other means than the wooden horse, until you get to late antiquity, which is more than 1,000 years after Homer. And there are no other stories in which a wooden horse appears. It's unique to Troy's story. If we think the Trojan horse stretches credulity but could hide a historical truth inside, we can try to rationalize it. People come up with explanations like saying it's a fantastical stand-in, a metaphor for a more conventional siege engine, for example a battering ram, that would really have been used. Battering rams were probably around in the Bronze Age, the era to which the Trojan War apparently belongs. And so were siege towers, wooden towers on wheels or rollers that could be moved up to a city wall and deliver warriors inside directly to the enemy's battlements. They're definitely early enough for bards like Homer to have heard of them and include one in the versions of the story that we have. But they didn't. So you have to ask, why not? What seems like a good rationalization requires that someone half heard, half remembered what a siege engine is, couldn't make sense of it, having never seen one at work, and out of fragments of faulty knowledge came up with a story of the wooden horse. Fans of this interpretation go further. Perhaps the protective cladding on the siege engine was a horsehide. Given what a precious and high-status symbol horses were in this era, that would be a surprising use for them. Ox hides, more abundant and a standard material for making shields, for example, would be much more likely. But we don't have a Trojan ox. Or is there an idea that siege engines were themselves thought to look a bit like an animal, possibly a horse? Perhaps not so far-fetched, given some of the images preserved from the Near East. But the siege engine theory also requires Bronze Age Greeks to be adept at the engineering challenges involved with bringing a ram or a tower up to the walls at the right point. We now know that Troy had a lower city around the high citadel, and this may have been protected by no more than a ditch and rampart, crowned by a wall of timber or mud brick. Now these defences could have been more easily accessible and vulnerable to a battering ram. But even so, to get at the citadel of Troy is much more difficult. Its massive stone walls are built thick and high, topped with mud brick to make them even taller. To bring a siege engine to enemy walls can mean filling in ditches that block its path, building ramps up to the wall where it sits atop a steep natural elevation, or simply so a mobile siege tower stands tall enough to allow the warriors inside to cross from its upper story to the enemy's battlement. Now this is a level of military sophistication that isn't found anywhere in the legend. The archaeology tells us that the Mycenaeans, which is the name archaeologists use for Bronze Age Greeks, were capable of ambitious civil engineering works and construction, including road building, fortifications, monumental architecture, and drainage works. We don't know if they were able to also bring that technology into the military sphere on an overseas expedition, especially at the time when historical Troy was destroyed. In any event, this is all supposition. There's no reference to siegecraft in the legendary stories, and a show-stopping, overwhelming assault on Troy, carried out with battering rams and siege towers, is a surprising thing for the tradition to completely forget. The Trojan Horse is a very consistent part of the legend in all its particulars. Even if you agree that it's a bit fanciful, and think perhaps a battering ram sounds much more likely as the actual thing the Trojan Horse stands for, you might also stop to think whether you're throwing out the right part of the myth. Does a siege engine in fact do the job the Trojan Horse does in the story? Now there's another school of thought that suggests that the horse was actually a ship. This is another attempt at saying the tradition has preserved a confused version of what really happened. There are some literary and iconographical reasons why, comparing ships to horses or ships to figureheads in the shape of horses. You can't sail into Troy, so if the Trojan Horse was actually a ship, we might have to imagine it was a ship left on the beach as a fake tribute, just as the Trojan Horse was said to have been, with warriors hidden inside. It frankly doesn't get us very far in giving us a more plausible version of the story, just a different shaped device for smuggling warriors into the city. Or maybe the wooden horse was constructed using ship's timbers. At the port of Canucule, near the archaeological site of Troy, stands a Trojan horse model that was used in the 2004 movie Troy, which starred Brad Pitt as the Greek hero Achilles. This looks somewhat more convincing than its cousin at Troy itself, and in particular, it looks like it's been crafted from ship's timbers. That's a logical supposition when you think about where the Greeks were going to get all that wood to build it from. Presumably, enough of them had been killed at Troy they weren't going to be needing all of the 1,186 ships that had brought them to Troy 10 years previously. Now, the ship theory at least preserves a key element in the story. The fall of Troy is a result of trickery. And that is just as sound a basis in history as a way of taking cities as battering rams and siege towers. And it also makes for a very good story, because it's about human ingenuity and human failings. Here's an interesting parallel from more recent times. There's the story of how the Vikings laid siege to Paris in 845 CE, under a leader called Ragnar, who is sometimes identified with the semi-legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, hero of the Vikings TV series. Now, this siege definitely happened, there's no doubt about that, but in one version of the story, after the siege has dragged on for some time, the Vikings put word out that their leader Ragnar has died of illness, and having just been baptized, his last wishes were to have a Christian funeral inside the city. The Franks agreed to let the Vikings bring the coffin inside the walls, but then a very much alive Ragnar springs out of the coffin, in which is also hiding weapons for himself and his companions, and they kill the priests and guards. Attack from within and outside, Paris falls. But this version of the story doesn't belong in the history of the Siege of Paris. It's a modern TV retelling of an anecdote which actually belongs to a different Viking hero and a saga set in a different time and place. The creators of the Viking TV series didn't make the coffin trick story up out of nothing, but they thought it a great story beat to repurpose for their own retelling of the Siege of Paris. And in that TV series there is of course no doubt that the Ragnar who captures Paris is one and the same as the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, and the coffin trick is just the sort of thing he would do. Legend, history and storytelling combine to produce satisfying entertainment and create a new legend. Most of the Vikings' audience is probably not especially interested in which bits of the story they're being told are historically accurate. They put themselves in the hands of the storyteller, just as Homer's audience did back in ancient times. The viewers embrace the storyteller's evocation of the Viking age, which is epic, legendary, exciting, and full of larger-than-life characters. The story itself is more or less plausible, and it's especially suitable to the way they've drawn the character of Ragnar Lothbrok. The hero's cunning ruse is what gets him inside the walls of Paris and wins the day after frontal assaults have failed. This Viking's coffin is a Trojan horse. The essence of the Trojan horse is not carpentry or military engineering, but subterfuge, which has excellent historical pedigree as a way of breaking into besieged cities, especially if the kind of forces that are not skilled at military engineering or don't have the numbers to cut a city off completely and starve its defenders out. So, from a believability point of view, Perhaps the key takeaway of the Trojan Horse story is simply that the Greeks got inside Troy by deception and not by brute force. The horse conveys that story point. Battering ram or even a siege tower doesn't. And perhaps if you can't believe still in the Trojan horse, the minimalist explanation for the fall of Troy that does not require the Trojans to be quite so gullible, and the one that has, again, any number of respectable real history parallels, is simply that traitors within Troy itself let them in. The essence of making historical drama is that you often need a lot of elaboration to weave a satisfying story out of the bare bones of historical events that took place when hardly anyone was noting down the details of what happened. And when the historical drama becomes the only record of events you have, picking out which parts are original and which are invention, elaboration, or borrowings from other tales is ultimately a bit arbitrary. Stories are really about the motivations and actions of human characters. Archaeology doesn't speak that language. It speaks of cultural trends, economics, land use, resources, settlement patterns, burial practices, elite display, which is how the wealthy like to show off their status, pottery styles, trade patterns, food pathways, almost never about individual characters. The archaeological answer to a historical Trojan War lies in connected and competing powers on either side of the Aegean during the 13th century BCE, possibly the slide into chaos across the region that was happening at the end of that century and into the next. But archaeology won't and cannot tell you whether a Trojan prince broke the rules of good behaviour in stealing the wife of a king of Sparta, whose brother happens to be High King of all the Achaeans, and is happy to use this outrage as a pretext to summon them to war. And given you cannot expect any trace of a wooden horse to survive for more than 3 millennia to be rediscovered by modern archaeology, it won't answer the question of, was the Trojan horse a real thing? Not unless one day we find a contemporary record that maps out what really happened. Not impossible, but really quite unlikely. The evidence that the Trojan horse really existed remains as it always has. There's a legend that says so. There is archaeological evidence that says the war in which the Trojan horse played its part may have happened, but it's not conclusive. And there's not a shred of evidence that the Trojan horse is just a fantasy, that it never existed. The truth is far more complex and far more interesting. But let's not lose sight of the fact it serves the purpose of telling a good story. And to that end, we have to accept that ancient storytellers, generations of them, were busy elaborating on plots and character motivations and cooking up dramatic scenes to move, amuse, or thrill their audiences. And let's not forget that when real people are involved in events, unbelievable things can happen. This episode of Troy Story is an impossible factual production for The History Trip. It was written and presented by Jonathan Drake, the music was by Simon Passmore, and the editor was Egley Kelly.